Hello, everyone, and welcome this fine rainy afternoon in Copenhagen. My name is Emma Holten, and this is a part of the Beyond Growth, Talks Beyond Growth series. I'm going to be your host and moderator today, but I won't be speaking a lot. Today, we'll be speaking about the relationship between the economic system, economics as a discipline, and the relationships between the fights against racism and the fights against neocolonialism. And we have a really formidable speaker here today, Lebohang Liepollo Pheko, who's going to present her thoughts for half an hour in just a moment. And then there'll be plenty of time after that for audience questions. So please, when Liepollo is speaking, just make your notes and be ready when you get the time, because there'll be plenty of time for you to give your thoughts. There are two ways you can do it. You can both write in the chat when the talk is over, but you can also go on screen if I raise your hand and I'll pick you, and you can be free to ask your question. So just to introduce Lebohang a little bit, she's a senior research fellow at the feminist think tank called the Trade Collective, and based in South Africa, where they focus on the role and erasure of the global majority in Western male-dominated economics, in the economic institutions, in economic thinking, in like the big bilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, really looking globally at the economic system and how the global majority is and their role is really being erased from the economic system in that place. So, and she defines herself as you will hear probably also from her work, as a decolonial Africanist feminist. And I won't be taking up much time because I'm sure there's someone here who has something much more interesting to say. So I'll just give the word to you now, Lebohang, to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have time for questions. Thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to have you.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks to the colleagues who have joined the call. Good evening from very sunny South Africa. We are in somewhere in late summer, approaching autumn, our version of autumn. It's still very warm, and I think it's a good time to also have a conversation about what alternatives mean. And I think I'll situate it within where I am geographically. So I live about 3.5 hours outside of Gauteng, Johannesburg, which most of you will have heard of. And the town that I'm living in at the moment has been flooded. So for a few weeks, I was a climate refugee and couldn't come back because of the climate and the ecological trauma in the area. And that's a real thing. And I think every time that we hear about, for example, I think last week there was flooding in Malawi, 200 souls were taken away at that time. And, because of the border, the way that our borders are configured, all of these things leak into different contexts, into different geographies. And I think that it's important at this time, firstly, to stand in solidarity with the many who have lost their lives and are losing their lives daily. And I think with the many people who are losing their lives to neoliberal capitalism, who are dying slowly and quickly in different ways, as states begin to, refuse to act as states, as multinationals and corporations continue to act as though they are supranational beings, and actually act as the governance prefects of default, of choice, where white capital and external international capital has actually become a slush fund through which many economies are run. So I think the context of what I'm going to talk about is really to situate what growth means in the context of all of these vagaries, in the context of all of this violence and trauma that the planet is experiencing, that people are experiencing interpersonally, that the economies are experiencing, that different nation states are experiencing, that women and men are experiencing, and of course that Black people and brown people, or people of the majority world, are experiencing, and especially women of the majority world, and the experiences that we walk through and talk through as well. And I want to suggest through this input that feminism is one of the best ways of reframing and rethinking and reconfiguring community and shared well-being, particularly in the presence of such, the current global economies, which are basically continuities of what I think is colonial logic. I also would like to situate what Audre Lorde, the great African-American feminist, said when she spoke about well-being and health as being an act of deep resistance. It is extremely difficult to be well, to arrive whole, and to remain whole, especially in the construct of neoliberal economics, in the construct of governance, multinational corporate governance, and also the cooptation of different forces of energies, which should be actually governing us, but in fact are acting as facilitators for vague global capital. So basically being well and well-being economics, I would see as an act of resistance. I would also like to think that this is actually an intersection. There's a deep intersection between what we are calling, what I characterize as well-being economics and feminist economics, including Black women's economics, especially as a reaction against neoliberal colonialism and neoliberal imperialism. So firstly, I think it's important to situate this in the context of intersectionality. And as Emma has said, I think of myself as a decolonial Africanist feminist. And I also think of myself as somebody who uses the intersectional approach because it is one that is also an act of resistance. It confronts the deeply racialized assumptions that inform the economy, and that Black and brown women in particular have many ways of being and many ways of appearing. Bearing in mind that we are the ones who primarily are carrying the burden of neoliberal economics globally. So, for example, the fact that the movement of people and migration, the global migration and labor migration is predominantly either between urban and rural areas, but the pull is towards where there's a metropolis, where there are economic possibilities, or between the majority world to the minority world of the so-called global north, right? And that this is really a continuum, I suggest, of the kinds of movement of people and the logic of global economics, which has really subsisted on the back of free or even cheap labor of people of the majority world, African people, people from the Middle East, Asian people, Latin American people, and from the Caribbean as well. So, for example, the entire industry of enslaving African people and carrying them to other worlds was basically the formation of this colonial logic and this imperial logic. And this is where the conversation on even reparations becomes very uncomfortable, because basically, if the minority world will begin to calibrate, and I think people like my colleague Jason Hickel have done a lot of work on calibrating the cost, the contribution that Black and brown women in particular, but that Black and brown people as a whole have made to the minority world. Basically, most countries of the global north would be bankrupted. There are not enough trillions of dollars, euros, pounds, or yen to compensate for the contribution that we have made and are still making. I think moving on to that, I think is really to think around how well-being economics and feminist economics in particular make us extremely courageous and extremely fearless, because we then recognize that this then is a way of seeing the contribution of non-white women who are often invisibilized. So what feminist well-being economics does is that it rehumanizes and it recenters Black and brown women and our personhood. This is actually a bit of a pivot away from the conventional neoliberal, neoclassical construction of human rights. And my critique on the notion of human rights as a school of thought in the neoclassical sense is that human rights, as they were constructed by formations like the League of Nations and later on the United Nations, were actually constructed by a minority standpoint At the time, this was a few minority world nations who were defining and deciding based on their own positionality and based on their own economic and political vantage point, who was and was not human, and what was and was not a priority of humanity. Had that conversation included the majority world, it is very possible that we would have a different construction of what human rights are today. So I think that what this does, what feminist well-being economics does, is that it recognizes the humanity of Black and brown people and Black and brown women, but it also visibilizes them and gives them a sense of dignity by calibrating and understanding the huge contribution that we're making. This includes domestic work, unpaid work, work in the informal economy, work in what is called the care economy, social reproduction. So the language of informality in and of itself, which is what GDP trades off of. GDP doesn't count what the kind of work, the multiple layers of work and labor, paid and unpaid, that is conducted to make sure that the market economy, the mainstream or the mainstream economy, as I often call it, is able to function. So, terms like parallel work, parallel economy, gray economy then come to the fore. But even the notion of talking about informality, it diminishes this form of work and it mischaracterizes this form of labor, and it completely disrespects it as well. So when we speak in the language of informal, it then suggests that this is almost a hobby or something that is unimportant and insignificant. But the care economy we appreciate, and what is something that must happen in order for everything else to function, right? So children must go to school, children must be fed, the elderly must be cared for, houses must be kept clean somehow or other. And all of these things must happen in order for the rest, everything else to function. And if this central feature of care economics doesn't happen, everything else collapses, basically. So I think what feminist well-being economics has done and is doing is it's providing the language of not just formalizing this work, but validating this work, valorizing this work, and dignifying this work. Now, the history of feminist economics then goes back the literature goes back 60 to 70 years, and it critiques this notion and the recognition of household labor, and it suggests that, that these biases around the breadwinner. So I think most countries still have this bias around, tax, around taxes, male breadwinner bias, for example, head of household bias. And it completely obfuscates and ignores the supply of female labor, female work, which is treated basically as a free gift, an ongoing free gift to capitalism. And so we need to measure these things very differently. And the GDP does not measure and recognize any of this, yeah? So decolonial feminist economics also is a work in progress. I think that we are still constructing it. We're helping to create space for discussion. And I think that platforms like this are also helping to visibilize and make audible these conversations. So I think neoliberalism, as a response or a reaction against basic humanity, the basic personhood that I was speaking about earlier, has then created these very toxic human relations and economic relations. So it only sees one way to measure the economy. So the white world is really owed the labor of non-white people, as I've said, and that this links back to not only the trafficking of African people, the so-called slave trade, but also the colonial construct, and that Europe and the US were able to develop exponentially because of the enslaved labor of Black and brown people, and of course by extracting from the colonies, and the ongoing ways in which this extraction takes place through formations like the World Trade Organization, through formations, the extractive debt conditionalities that are put in place by the IMF, the World Bank, and so forth. And we saw this being re-inscripted during the COVID the earlier days of the COVID pandemic. I don't know, I'm not sure if we're ever going to be out of it, if we could ever talk about post-COVID, but certainly in 2020 and 2021, when the default was that, many countries wanted to go and get loans, the concern that was raised by many African countries and by heterodox economists like myself was that this really looks like we're going back into structural adjustment, just as we are basically putting our head out of water, but this is the model of extractivism that are being reproduced. So for example, what feminist well-being economics also does is that it gives us our own language. It has helped us to decolonize language and create spaces of those who don't really fit into the Eurocentric frames of what white families look like, white heteronormative households. So remember that capitalism and the creation and the invention of the modern family is basically a very Eurocentric one, because prior to this, remember that the family unit, 100 years ago, families were where work happened before the so-called industrial revolution, which of course coincides with the expansion of the colonial projects, by the way. No coincidences there, right? Is that basically, the family was the unit of production, and it was, but it was not a unit of consumption. Families produced what they needed, and they bartered what they did not need, and so forth. And I'm not saying that it was always exact science, because there were always this unequal and problematic social relations and feudal social relations. But however, this level of extractivism, extracting work from households and converting the notion of a family into a unit of consumption rather than a unit of production, is also an invention of white neoliberal patriarchal capitalism, including the notion of who the head of the household is. So basically, what well-being economics and feminist well-being economics also do is that they view relationships as central. So whereas, mainstream economics will want to talk about the rational man, and is a man out there, who is, and this notion of perfect supply, perfect consumption, perfect, competitive advantage and comparative advantage, and all of these things in such abstractions, and try to behave as though the economy is a place that is disjointed from us. It's almost like somewhere out there where, it's like Star Trek, it's somewhere out there, and yet it's right here and it's right now. So every time we go and buy bread, buy milk, buy airtime, buy data, buy petrol, whatever, we are participating in the economy. And if we think about it in a tangible way as a marketplace, as a place that we go physically, even if it's online, it's still going to a place. It is still entering a domain of sorts. That is a marketplace, and it belongs to us, and it cannot function without us. So what neoliberal capitalism has done is it's created false demand, it has created false tastes, and it's also created this notion of planned obsolescence, where things are not supposed to last any longer. So now there's the whole obsession with the latest iPhone, the latest laptop, the latest this, the latest that, Samsung, series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know what they're called. I've tried very hard to opt out of all of that with little success. But this whole idea that you need what you don't have, and that's just such a strange, perverse logic, isn't it? When I was growing up, we had a fridge that lasted 20 years. And it only, we only left it behind because it was too heavy to carry to the next country that we were going to. But basically, the stuff was made to last. But now in the era of planned obsolescence, this idea of creating and manufacturing demand, we can see that there's a huge relationship between artificial growth of GDP and artificial construction and manufacturing of demand and of taste. So what neoliberalism also does is that it recognizes, it tries to erase the past of colonialism, and the many family members that have been lost to us, especially on the African continent, the violence of colonialism and the ongoing series of violences that are still being inscripted. And what it also does is that it recognizes this relationship between sexism, racism, and patriarchy, because it is almost impossible to dissect the notion of racism from the notion of capitalism, and vice versa. It is Black people who were extracted to go and work in so-called white worlds, although they were occupied worlds, but be that as it may, at the behest of, settler colonies such as the United States, such as Brazil, which is a settler colony, of course, Canada, which is a settler colony, Australia, New Zealand, even though they did not have per se they did not have a slave trade per se, but they certainly occupied those spaces. And I think a little known fun fact for you guys is that, of course, South Africa was a slave state. The Cape Colony, the Western Cape, what is now part of Cape, surrounded Cape Town and surrounding areas, was actually a settler colony, a settler slave colony. So this thing has its tentacles globally, and the logic has carried over globally. I think another piece is really to give us a sense that feminist economics cares for all forms of life, as does well-being economics. And this is really, again, a radical shift away from the notion that some people are more important than others, and that some people, it also it flies in the face of so-called meritocracy, which is a construct that I really, really dislike, because the people who talk about meritocracy very rarely have worked particularly hard for what they have, what they have attained. It's usually certainly the recipients of intergenerational wealth, intergenerational privilege, intergenerational family names, connections, and so on and so forth. So I think that what it does, what feminist economics and well-being economics, that it centers real achievement, it centers real effort, it centers real work, it centers the work of caring and the caring for the work that matters. And I think that what we saw during the COVID moment was that many of feminist alternatives, which were framed around COVID bailouts, where immediately several feminists from the majority world were saying, what would a successful economy look like? And we were rethinking ideas and publishing quite prolifically ideas of what these would look like. And one of the things that we're very clear about is that we're not going to have a situation where banks are once more, like 2008, where banks are once more bailed out, whilst people lose their homes, lose their jobs, are furloughed, or have no form of basic income support. This also brought to the fore the conversations that needed to be had around basic income support, basic income grants, and moving away from a welfareist construction, a charity model of social support, and to really rethink what the public contract, the social contract is between the state and citizens, right? And I think that, it's also useful to think around what are the basic issues and the flaws with the GDP metric. So the one is that it's a calculator. It suggests that, the calculator that adds productive market transactions, including carbon emissions, which are not that productive, environmental pollution, loss of indigenous knowledge, including war, for example, the production of military of weapons. It counts things like, it counts and includes child labor. It counts things like drug trafficking, drug dealing, sex trafficking. I mean, it counts everything as a plus, even things that are antisocial or illegal or just inhuman. It also externalizes environmental, social, cultural costs associated to economically productive activities. And as I've mentioned, it doesn't count informal, or I'd rather say parallel activities, uncounted, invisibilized activities of social reproduction or the care economy. It also assumes that this earth and this planet has infinite resources, including people, that are going to be extracted, exploited, and polluted ad infinitum. And we can see that even the planet has long been protesting against this. And it doesn't measure or value qualitative elements. And I think this is the thing that's really quite useful, is that it doesn't think around what well-being looks like for different people. It doesn't understand what happiness looks like. So it's well and good to have a six-figure salary in your job and, driver. I don't know what people think is valuable, a Maserati or Porsche or whatever, but be absolutely miserable, or to have an unhappy family life. Or for your children not to even know who you are anymore, or to have stomach ulcers every time you think of going to the office because, you've got a horrible boss. Okay, you're wearing expensive suits, but your life is miserable. You haven't spoken to your parents in 6 months, etc., etc. So what is it? What does it mean to be in a state of well-being, a state of, of happiness? And this is where constructs like Brian Verveer are very useful because they take us to the notion of what it means to be happy in an essential way. GDP also doesn't count things like indigenous knowledge. It doesn't count past injustices, as I've mentioned. So it has made no allowances for the possibility of reparations, of reparative economics, of restorative economics, for example. And what are the sort of the multiple crises and the emergencies that are being caused by the GDP? So the one is the finance and economic emergency, including the crash of 2008 that I've already mentioned, which is leading to acute and widening inequalities. A second one would be climate, loss and damage, including landlocked countries and low island states. But as it turns out, even my little town where I live. Thirdly would be stuff like environmental exploitation, extraction, externalization, which is why I don't get very excited when I hear that the latest mining company wants to come and produce, wants to come and excavate for yet more minerals, or that an international company, a car manufacturer is coming here to manufacture steel in order to take parts, produce parts in tiny little pieces, which will then be assembled elsewhere, and at great cost to our own environment. And the other is really governance and the lack of accountability, the lack of holding to account multinational corporations, the lack of holding to account your Bretton Woods institutions, your WTOs, the lack of social protection, as I've mentioned, the lack of restitution, appropriate restitution and compensation for labor. And then I think the other piece is certainly the socioeconomic, including the unpaid labor of Black and Brown people, and especially women. And of course, the cultural losses and emergencies that have been caused by the GDP. So the loss of intellectual property, indigenous knowledge as an ongoing form of extraction. And of course, conceptually, we remember that Kuznets, who I guess Simon Kuznets, who invented the notion of GDP, later on did say himself that this was never meant to be a default measure. He did say himself that this was never meant to be the only way to measure progress. And it becomes quite a strange and slightly ridiculous thing when we consider that countries that were in between their own wars, European wars and the US with Russia thrown in, I suppose. But between 1914 and 1918 and 1939 and 1945, I mean, the idea that their own ways of reproducing and reconstructing and rebuilding the economies in a short-termist way was then picked up by the IMF and then later on imposed upon other countries. So the idea that, the way that growth should happen in Germany or in Canada is exactly the same way that growth should happen in a completely different context like Lesotho or Rwanda or Bangladesh or Nigeria or Somalia becomes really, really quite bizarre. And that this has now become almost a default of how we measure growth. And I think that the other thing around the things that are wrong with the GDP as a measure is that it tries to measure sameness where there is none. We really, contexts are just not the same. And I know that lots of people have these existential conversations about, what does well-being mean the same thing in Norway as it does in Senegal? It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. What has to happen is that people need to have the sovereignty, especially in the majority world, to define for ourselves what well-being means, preferably without external interference, preferably without aid conditionalities, preferably without the violences of having our own governance structures upended, our own leaders deposed, those sorts of things, preferably without any other external exogenous interferences, preferably without the ongoing reforming ways, ongoing elongations of colonial interference in small and large ways, whether it's through your Bretton Woods institutions, whether it's through the electoral industry, the industrial electoral complex, or the international development complex, which is a twin, I suppose, and so forth. But it is for us to define for ourselves, country to country, sometimes even region to region, sometimes even city to city, what well-being means in our own context. I think I'll pause right there. Excuse my voice. I think I'm catching a flu, but I think I can pause now for a few questions and reflections and clarifications. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this global overview of the way that we can use feminist economics. This was so enlightening and useful. Everyone, you can feel free to start asking your questions in the chat box now, but I think I'm going to start with one. I have the privilege of being the moderator, so I can jump in front in line of everybody. And I think something that's so interesting with your work is that we've seen many, Marxist masculinist analysis of the IMF or structural adjustment. But I think using feminist economics to look at these things from a feminist point of view really adds to the analysis of the neo-colonial structures of the Bretton Woods institutions. And for people who don't know the Bretton Woods institutions, these were the institutions that were made after the Second World War to kind of control the global economies. That's the World Bank, the UN, and the IMF. And I want to ask you, what for you is it that the feminist lens really gives to our analysis of the Bretton Woods institutions and the power that they still hold in the relationship between the global North and the global South? These minority institutions that have such a grip on the majority, because of course we're situated here in Europe, a global minority that still holds a tremendous power.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting question. And I think one of the things that I suppose feminist economics has given us and majority world feminists as well have also given is the notion of racializing some of the economic relations and naming them accordingly and situating them within this colonial construct. So I think the framing of intersectionality is one I think I mentioned earlier that I use quite vociferously, quite often. So which was framed by Black feminists in the US, like Patricia Collins, like Kimberly Crenshaw, to a lesser extent Bell Hooks as well. And what this does is it understands questions of power, it understands questions of exclusion and oppression in a particular way, and it humanizes those oppressions and it centers them. It also gives the opportunity to understand how those oppressions manifest, for example, in low pay, for example, in higher indebtedness, poor life outcomes, poorer health, for example, household poverty, time impoverishment, especially for Black and brown women. The fact that, on the hierarchy of humanity, it's very difficult for non-white women to buy time, mainly because of our socioeconomic structure and what the institutions like your IMFs and your Bretton Woods have done by demobilizing public expenditure is then to increase this burden upon women, especially women of the majority world. So by disinvesting in education, disinvesting in public health, disinvesting in social infrastructure like electricity, for example, like drainage systems, like school systems, for example, school food, school transport. So all of this means that it's just more stuff for many women to have to do, or you then have to find the means to get private transportation, private service providers to take your children to school if you don't have a car, and so forth. This also then reinscripts and puts in place, reinforces class binaries, very deep and particular schisms of class binaries. And I think it's worth saying that most children around the world, and I think it's spectacular to think about that when one is sitting in a particular global situation, but most children across the world walk to school as we speak. Most children, a large percentage of children walk to school, walk long distances, small children, 5, 6, 7-year-old children in all kinds of weather conditions. And this is really, again, a feature of what structural adjustment and the inhumanity of your Bretton Woods institutions has produced.
I have so many things I want to ask you. I don't think we have any questions yet, so I'm just going to keep asking mine. And I think something really interesting you said is that what we don't have now is that we don't have a system that validates care. We don't have a system that makes care visible. And I want to ask you, and of course, this is a hypothetical utopian question, But to you, of course, as you mentioned at the end of your talk, it will be different for every place. But could you give us a sense for you? What does a society that values care look like? How would it be different from some of the structures that we have today?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the different conversations. I mean, I know some countries are having conversations about salaries for stay-at-home mothers or even stay-at-home fathers. Not many of them, but in those cases, is that part of dealing with this issue? I'm not sure. I do think that the other piece of is it about I think it's very important that in finding solutions, we don't find solutions that actually support very flat gender binary, gendered roles as well, and that we need to be revolutionizing and rethinking how families function, how communities function, what is viewed as care work, who should be caring for whom. And also, I think another important question is who should care for the carer? That's the other piece that often goes missing is in all of this, because women are always subsidizing everybody else in society, who is caring for the carer? And then, I think things around public health, which should be free, which should be accessible, which should be qualitative, is what would a validating care economy would look like. Creches, kindergartens that are accessible in areas where women work, whether it's near marketplaces, whether it's every office block, every apartment block, every community should have qualitative care facilities for parents who want to leave their children there should they choose to. That should be available, and that should be subsidized by the state. That should be part of education, in the same way that we lobby for free education, and most countries have varying qualities of free education. Sometimes you get what you pay for, but most countries now have accepted that you have to have free education in some form, no matter how shoddy the facilities received may be, and that's a whole other conversation. But that certainly that the education complex must be part of the care complex, right? So that we should, from 0 to 18, there has to be accessible care, and that includes care after hours as well. So we had to spend a lot of time and money with our kids when they were growing up. Thank God they're all grown up now. But having care, after school activities, after care activities and so forth, for when everybody was still at work or somebody was traveling, and so on and so forth. And these are practicalities that we need to deal with. And again, I'm very clear about my own class privilege that enables me to make those sorts of arrangements. And many people do not have the capacity to have those sorts of arrangements. And yet we are then subsidizing the state for what the state should be doing. I think another piece of what that would look like would be accessible public transport. Now, again, I know in many European countries, it's inconceivable. I lived for 16 years in the UK, and the idea of not having 24-hour transport is just, it's just not there. I didn't drive a car. I didn't need to until I came back to South Africa. And, because this public transport matrix is so fragmented, to say the very least. And I think that's what it looks like. It looks like a safe public space, a safe public transport matrix where people can get from one place to the next, especially women, can get well lit, can get from one place to the next without any fear. Without any fear, any danger, any sense in which something could go wrong per se. So I think that's roughly what I would hope a caring social reproductive, a validated social reproductive system would look like.
I think it's really interesting because, of course, some of the things you mentioned is something that we have in a welfare state like Denmark. But Denmark, of course, is a country that's built on the back and exploitation of poorer countries. So I think what's really interesting is, can we build this without exploitation of cheap labor, of other people, other countries' resources, etc. But we've gotten some questions here in the chat, and I think you mentioned earlier lobbying for these types of changes. And the first question is about that. It's Blas Sorko who writes, what would you say is the main vector for facilitating change in our elected governments to start the transition to a more social and equal society in the framework of feminist economics? I think this is a question about how do we affect change within our elected governments? What are the roads for change in achieving some of these changes that you're talking about?
Interesting. I think, and that's that's the hard work. And unfortunately, there are no five easy steps, 6 strategic points, 10 campaign approaches to it. It's kind of a really long, hard work of organizing. But I think what's really interesting about this is it also depends on how we are relating to power and how we are relating to elected officials or unelected officials, even unelected aspirants, right? Because oftentimes by the time people emerge as potential candidates, I'm not sure whether we do enough work to rigorously interrogate what they have to say. And I think what we often hear is the things that are what we're attracted to are the things that we like to hear, the things that tickle our ears. So I'd be very tickled by somebody who said something positive about women, representation, blah, blah, and perhaps not be as rigorous in perhaps what they're saying about other stuff. What are their thoughts of militarization? What are they planning to spend on military expenditure, for example? And I think that it's up to us to really to provide that rigorous critique and rigorous accompaniment of people who feel that they want to be in office. But I think a parallel strategy is who are we voting for? And so who are we voting for and why are we voting for them? And then in terms of, a transition to a more socially equal society, what is the work that needs to be done in terms of framing these parallel manifestos and manifestos? So, for example, some of the work that we've been doing in different parts of the world, a couple of African countries, a couple of Asian countries as well, is to look at what are the existing frameworks. So some of the countries that we're examining are already up to their eyeballs in IMF debt, for example. So it's to say, how do we re-extract ourselves from this? How do we re-inscript ourselves away from these PRSPs, from structural adjustment, to create the policy and the financial space to be able to be much more autonomous? What are the existing platforms like CEDAW, like the Beijing platform? As much as some people may feel that they're not as effective as they used to be or they should be, but these are the kinds of instruments that governments have signed up to. Governments have signed up to the SDGs. Where are the spaces within that for citizens, for different, community groups, advocates, activists, scholars, students, and so forth, different communities, to then scrutinize those and hold the states to account, make use of, for example, the parliamentary system, make use, for example, of our own MPs, our own local councillors as well. So it's very slow, granular work. It also needs a lot of mass mobilization, I think, between trade unions, for example, between feminist groups, between agricultural groups, between student groups, between sort of larger constellations of formations, right? Because I think that is where you then begin to see a shift in power and a shift in ideation. I mean, I enjoy sort of some of these British programs, these panorama type, where politicians are forced to come before the nation, and they can sometimes look ridiculous. They can sometimes look like they're sleepwalking, but you see them as they are. And I wonder whether there's the opportunity to invent and to create those spaces. I mean, obviously, our contexts differ. Sometimes, in some places we don't have as much access as we would like to have. Sometimes the access is mediated through different social, political lenses as well. And who has access to who is sometimes often very mediated as well. But I think that it just takes a lot of multi-sector, work across different constituencies to build that mass, and also maybe eventually the work of trying to become, of trying to develop a cadreship that can take leadership later on, but that's also very, very long term.
Yeah, this is the next question is a bit of an extension of this. This is a questioner, Sarah, who often finds herself a little bit cynical about whether their state is able, and the current liberal democracy is able to really undertake radical changes in our economic models. And she asks, you're talking about this long granular work, but do we also need revolts in our lives? And of course, revolts can look different in different ways. What's your thoughts on strategies that are maybe civil disobedience, for example, or destruction of private property? What are your thoughts on stuff like that? Is that a way to go, or do you more believe in changes within the liberal democratic system?
Yeah, look, I'm a South African, so we don't do things softly. As we go in hard, we go in very much direct action. And that's a tradition that I am very comfortable with, because I don't think that power cedes. Power is taken, and that is what it is. And there will also often be casualties in that, and that's a very uncomfortable conversation. But I think that, yeah, that's the tradition that I come from, of direct action, and that, power must be taken by almost any means necessary. So I think that, hence I say contexts differ as well. And I think that the interesting thing about this question is that it makes me think around the nature of states. So one of my hypotheses is that states, in the first place, I don't think states like women anyway, particularly, states that were formerly colonized. But I think states in general, I just don't think they like women. I think that the states have always had a problem with feudal power relations, what to do with women, the little woman. They've always had a problem with how to deal with women. And I think that I've written about how I think that states treat women as adjacent, basically adjacent to the national project, wherever that project might be. It could be the United States, it could be France, it could be Australia, it could be Brazil, it could be Nigeria, it could be Sweden, it could be Swaziland. So, contexts differ, but I don't think in the first instance that states like women very much. I think that there's been a violent exclusion of women. I think that we see this violence manifesting itself through legislation. A country like the United States, the so-called greatest democracy in the world, doesn't even have paid maternity leave. That's the most violent thing, the most violent anti-women, anti-reproductive rights thing that I can imagine. It's mind-boggling to me. So I think that it's not only around transitioning towards a feminist economy or democratic processes, but were these processes even designed for us in the first place? I'm not sure about that, which is why we still have to have debates around, are we ready for women presidents? Are we ready for women and count how many people there are in, how many women there are in leadership. And then, of course, I was very disappointed, but I saddened that the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who I thought was doing some interesting work and offered some interesting forms of leadership, resigned because basically she was exhausted and she's had enough. And I was like, I can deeply sympathize with that. I can deeply sympathize with that, understanding that a lot of these spaces are so misogynistic, are so painful to be in, actually. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question with no easy responses.
I think many feminist activists can relate to exhaustion and the feeling of being devalued even when you're doing your political work. There's a question here about what your thoughts are on global minority Marxist feminist thinkers like Nancy Fraser. And I think maybe what the question is getting at is where do you see the role of Marxism in this? Many feminists who work on feminist economics find themselves very close to Marxism, but of course Marxism is also a global minority construction in some ways, but has been adopted by many people in the global South. Do you find Marxism to be a useful framework in your work?
Yeah, I have a very complicated relationship with Marx. Every year at the beginning of the academic year, I try to kill Marx. I try to, not to cite him, not to use his framing, not to use his construction. But every year I fail because unfortunately his models have been and his framing has been extremely, it's been extremely interesting, useful, even though problematic and in other regards. So, it's I found Marx when I was studying sociology when I was 16 years old, and I found him very interesting because it helped me to rethink class formation. It helped me to think around class and labor formation. And it also gave me the nascent language that I needed, the scaffolding that I needed, I think, to understand the notion of empire and how empire has been built on the petty bourgeoisie and the subalterns, right? So, I mean, in that regard, it's been really, really useful. But on the other hand, I think that, where Marx meets, a lot of people are trying to find Marx in post-colonial feminism, for example, which is courageous, to say the least. And I think, they can potentially collide in different ways, exactly when we look at the way, how he deals with the means of production, how he deals with the means of redistribution, how he deals with, for example, the theoretical framings of what work actually means and how that work is experienced in different parts of the world. And so it's not surprising that many decolonial, anti-colonial thinkers and revolutionaries were themselves, found great use in the work of Marx. And people like Nkrumah, people like Marcus Garvey, even I think Martin Luther King read a bit of Marx here and there. Different people who have found him quite useful. People like first president of India, Nehru, was a Marxist. Different, including majority world leaders, especially the first wave of anti-imperial and post-independence leaders, found some use in his work. And of course, I think many feminists, because of the framing of the hierarchy of power, analyzing global value chains, where women, especially Black and brown women, are situated on those global value chains, again, are finding some utility in Marx. But I'm not sure whether that utility is because Marx is so great, or because they themselves are able to frame and to think and to, I think they are writing beyond Marx, actually. I think a lot, including Nancy, I think she has written beyond Marx, in my opinion. I mean, I have great respect for her work, while understanding that there are limitations with her positionality being in the global north. But I think that, I think she has made phenomenal contributions as a feminist economics in framing some of these hegemonies of socialism, capitalism, and where they collide with patriarchy.
Yeah, I'm also a big Nancy fan. But I think we have 4 minutes left. We have time for a last question, which is a big one. And I think you mentioned this shortly in your talk, that you called it the complex discussion around reparations.
Yes.
And this question is about past harm,
Yes.
and how our relationship should be to past harm. Should there, in our activism, should there be strategies for repairing past harm? Or does that limit us? Should we only be looking forward? How should we relate to the harm that has happened in the past, maybe especially from your vantage point in the global majority?
Interesting, very interesting, fascinating question. So some of the parallel work I've been doing, you may be aware, for the last few years, I've also been, I am still a Lancet commissioner on reparations, as it happens, since 2019, along with people like Jason Hickel is my colleague there, William Darity, who has done a lot of work on reparations for African Americans in the US, people like Sir Hilary Beckles, who, as you know, the the vice chancellor of the University of West Indies, and I think globally one of the great reparations thinkers. So so that's certainly been foremost on my mind as well. It's certainly was kind of the other thing that I do, and I try to bring these things together because I think they're important. So there's something to be said about, let's leave it behind, don't look back, go forward, what's done is done, etc. I think there's something very callous about that approach if one understands that the house I'm living in, if you know that the house you're living in, you took from somebody else and they're now sleeping on a park bench. I think it's difficult to be like, oh, well, what's done, it's done. I'll throw you a sandwich on your park bench. That's kind of the analogy I would use. I also think that acknowledgement is very important. It's important, firstly, for our own spiritual health, to be honest. I think it's impossible at some point to ignore the intergenerational trauma that things like colonialism, like imperialism have wrought. And that I think that we carry trauma differently. So I think as majority world people, we are carrying a lot of trauma. I think minority world people are carrying a different kind of trauma, the trauma of power, the trauma of anxiety, the trauma of guilt, of unnamed guilt, of unnamed sin as well, not to sound Catholic or anything, but, I think that things have, things sit with us and things have consequences. And, I think, I subscribe to notions similar to, which are karma adjacent, that this is a circle of life and of death and of life and of death, and that we are all obliged to correct even that which we were not present for. And I think this is where the questions on how far back should we go become very tricky, because people are like, well, I wasn't there. I didn't take anybody's land and I didn't take anything from anybody. It's like, well, just face it. You're not here because you're the smartest person in the room. You're here because your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents. You're here because of of privilege, white privilege, male privilege, class privilege. And I think acknowledgement is very liberating. So that's just on a spiritual, individual level. Now, on a community level, what does that look like? In the last 30 seconds. On a community level, I think that looks like beginning to think through what personal actions one can take, the kind of dialogues one can have with different communities, groups, and so forth. What kind of personal learning, that groups can take, whether it's through the curriculum, through teaching, through, as organizations. What does that potentially look like? What does it also look like in terms of lobbying states and government? That overseas development aid, that ODA, that 0.0000, which is really a minuscule, that should never be. And some people are saying that that's a reparation. I think you saw recently that the Netherlands is going to provide 200 million euros as, I think that's loose change, to say the least. And I think, as a South African, and understanding the damage that the Dutch East India Company did to this country on their way to doing more damage to Asia as well. That's hardly loose change. That's really pocket money, to say the least, chump change, insulting to say the least. So I think that the kind of lobbying that I was talking about before, to really lobby governments to say that, more needs to be done, more needs to be done. And how can this become a constructive debate, a constructive, productive way forward? Change is difficult, and change will always meet resistance. It doesn't mean to say that change is wrong, that the action is wrong. And as I said, privilege is comfortable. And of course, who wants to be reminded that what they have is basically not what they earned? It's very uncomfortable. It's very unsettling. It creates an existential crisis. Like, well, who am I if I'm not? If what would I be if it hadn't been for centuries and centuries of plunder? Then who would I be, basically? And I can sympathize with that anxiety, but I think it's an anxiety that every white person just has to go through and deal with. I think everybody in the minority world needs to deal with that anxiety and face that anxiety honestly.
That is all our time. Dear Lebohang Liepollo Pheko, thank you so much for your generosity. I think an economist would say both on the micro and macro level, we've been deep inside our hearts, and we've been up in the halls of the IMF and the World Bank. It's just been for an hour. We really covered so much ground, and you've been so generous with us. And I really, really want to thank you for taking this time to be with us today.
Thank you so much.
Next week, we'll be back again, and I'll be the moderator again. We'll be here with another feminist complete icon, just like Lebohang, Wendy Harcourt, who's going to talk about ecological economics and feminist economics and its relationship to nature. That's going to be extremely interesting. That's going to be in a week. Thank you again, Lebohang, for your time, and thank you everybody for coming and for your questions. It's been lovely spending an hour online with you, and go out and do some direct action. I'll see you all later. Thank you so much.